I changed my will to leave my entire estate, worth just over $4 million, to my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, then secretly recorded her celebrating with her lover about how they'd been slowly poisoning me. 3 days later, I watched her face collapse as my attorney revealed the truth. She would receive nothing but a criminal investigation. The look in her eyes as she realized I had outsmarted her was worth every moment of the 6 months I spent setting my trap. At 68, after 4 decades as a cardiologist, I thought I understood human nature. I'd seen patients face death with dignity and others rage against their diagnoses. I'd witnessed families pull together through crises and fall apart under pressure. But nothing in my professional experience prepared me for discovering that my own son's wife was methodically trying to kill me. The first signs were subtle. After Vanessa moved in to help care for me following my minor stroke last year, I experienced unexplained episodes of dizziness, confusion, and heart palpitations. As a physician, I found the symptoms puzzling. They didn't align with my known conditions or medication side effects. I began to suspect something was wrong when I noticed my symptoms worsened after Vanessa prepared my evening tea, which she insisted on making personally each night as a small way to show her appreciation. Rather than confront her immediately, I purchased a small safe with a combination lock and began secretly disposing of the tea while pretending to drink it. Within 3 days, my symptoms improved dramatically. That's when I knew. The realization that someone in my own home, someone my son Michael loved, was trying to harm me, was like a physical blow. I sat alone in my study that night, hands trembling as I considered my options. I could call the police, but without evidence, it would be my word against hers. I could tell Michael, but he'd been so blinded by her for the past 5 years that I feared he wouldn't believe me. Instead, I called James, my attorney of 30 years and the only person I felt I could trust completely. "We need to gather evidence," he advised after listening to my suspicions. "And we need to understand her motivation. Is it just about your money, or is there something else?" That conversation was the beginning of what James later called the most unusual estate planning strategy of his career. We staged an elaborate charade. First, I made a show of updating my will, deliberately ensuring that Vanessa accidentally discovered me meeting with James at the house. I left financial documents conspicuously visible on my desk, statements showing my investments, properties, and retirement accounts. When she inquired, trying to sound casual, I told her I was putting my affairs in order, following my health scare. Then came the masterstroke. I asked Vanessa to witness the signing of my new will, making sure she glimpsed just enough of the document to see her name prominently featured. "I've always thought of you as a daughter," I told her, maintaining eye contact while she struggled to conceal her excitement. "Michael is my only child, and you've brought him such happiness. I want to ensure you're both taken care of." The real will, of course, had been executed privately at James's office the previous day, leaving my estate to several medical charities with a modest provision for Michael contingent on his divorce. That evening, I activated the recording devices James had helped me install throughout the house. Small, unobtrusive cameras and microphones placed in the living room, kitchen, and guest bedroom that Vanessa used as her personal space. Then I announced I was taking a sleeping pill and retiring early. Instead of sleeping, I watched the live stream on my tablet from my bedroom, the door locked securely. I didn't have to wait long. At 9:47 p.m., Vanessa made a phone call. "It's done," she said, her voice animated in a way I'd never heard when she spoke to me. "The old man signed everything over to me today. Can you believe it? $4.2 million at least. The house alone is worth 1.5. She laughed, a harsh sound that bore no resemblance to the gentle chuckle she affected around Michael and me. No, he has no idea. The digoxin in his tea should finish him off within a month. The doctors will just think his heart gave out. Happens all the time with old men. There was a pause. Of course, I'm sure. I've been careful with the dosage. And anyway, I'm the grieving daughter-in-law who's been selflessly taking care of him. No one will question it. I felt strangely calm as I listened to her discuss my impending death. Perhaps it was my medical training, the ability to detach emotionally when necessary, or maybe it was the cold anger crystallizing inside me. She mentioned a man named David, apparently her lover of 2 years. They planned to wait 6 months after my death. Then she would divorce Michael, claiming she couldn't bear to live in the house with all the memories. The casual cruelty with which she discussed discarding my son after stealing my money and taking my life awakened something in me I hadn't known existed, a capacity for calculated retribution. The next morning, I began implementing the second phase of my plan. I smiled at Vanessa over breakfast, complimented her on the fresh flowers she'd arranged, and mentioned that I'd slept better than I had in months. As I watched her stir what I now knew was a toxic brew into my fresh tea, I felt an almost clinical fascination. How had I missed the signs? The slight tremor in her hand as she passed me the cup. The way her eyes lingered just a moment too long on my face as I pretended to drink. The satisfied little smile as she turned away. For 3 more days I gathered evidence while appearing increasingly frail and confused. I recorded her phone calls to David, documented my symptoms, and secured samples of the contaminated tea. On the 4th day, I invited Michael to join us for a family meeting with my attorney. Vanessa arrived in the living room wearing a somber black dress that I realized, with a chill, she had likely chosen for my funeral. The look of shock that transformed her face when James revealed the truth about the will and the police officers waiting in the hallway is something I will carry with me to my actual grave. But that moment was just the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape what remained of my family forever. The real question now was what to do about my son, who sat stunned beside the woman who had planned to murder his father. 3 months earlier, I wouldn't have believed anyone capable of what I eventually discovered. The first signs were so innocuous: a missing watch here, a misplaced ring there. Nothing that couldn't be explained away by the forgetfulness that comes with age. I'm 72, and while my mind remains sharp, I've learned to question myself first before suspecting others. But when my grandfather's gold pocket watch disappeared from my bedside drawer, a family heirloom I'd planned to give to my grandson on his 18th birthday, I knew something wasn't right. My son Michael had suggested I was simply misplacing things. "Dad, you probably put it somewhere for safekeeping and forgot," he'd said with that patient tone reserved for aging parents. His wife, Vanessa, had been even more solicitous, offering to help search the house. She'd spent an entire Saturday afternoon opening drawers and checking behind furniture, her concern seemingly genuine. When the watch didn't turn up, she'd squeezed my shoulder and said, "Don't worry, Richard. It'll show up when you least expect it." I'd nodded, grateful for her kindness, though the loss still gnawed at me. After my wedding ring vanished the following week, the one Margaret had slipped onto my finger 50 years ago, I decided enough was enough. I didn't mention this second disappearance to Michael or Vanessa. Instead, I drove to the electronics store and purchased a small security system, 3 inconspicuous cameras that connected to my iPad. The young salesman had been patient, walking me through the setup process twice to make sure I understood. "These are motion-activated, sir. They'll only record when someone's in the room," he'd explained. The entire system cost $329, which seemed reasonable for peace of mind. I installed one camera in my bedroom, angled toward my dresser and bedside table. Another went in my home office, where I kept important documents, and the third in the living room. They were small enough to be unobtrusive, black lenses no bigger than a quarter, tucked behind picture frames and books. I told no one about them. If I was wrong, if I was simply becoming forgetful, no one would ever need to know I'd gone to such lengths. For 2 weeks, the cameras revealed nothing unusual. I watched footage of myself moving around the house, the occasional visit from Michael, and twice-weekly visits from Vanessa, who often stopped by with groceries or to help with household chores. I began to think I might be overreacting after all. Perhaps the missing items would turn up, just as Michael had suggested. I even considered removing the cameras, feeling slightly foolish for my suspicion. Then came that Tuesday afternoon in April. I'd been at a doctor's appointment, a routine checkup that had taken longer than expected because of some concerns about my blood pressure. My cardiologist had adjusted my medication, increasing the dosage of my heart pills. "Your numbers are higher than I'd like, Richard," Dr. Kaplan had said. "Let's see if this helps bring things back to normal." I'd left with a new prescription, which I'd filled immediately at the pharmacy next door. When I returned home, I remembered the security footage. It had become a habit to check it daily, though I'd begun to do so with less urgency. Settling into my recliner with a cup of tea, I opened the app on my iPad and scrolled through the day's recordings. The bedroom camera had been triggered twice, once in the morning before I left, and again about an hour after I'd gone. I tapped on the second recording, expecting to see the housekeeper who came on Tuesdays. Instead, I saw Vanessa. She entered my bedroom, glancing over her shoulder as if to ensure she was alone. My breath caught as I watched her go directly to my bedside table and open the drawer where I kept my medications. Her movements were purposeful, not the casual actions of someone helping to tidy up. She picked up the orange prescription bottle containing my heart medication and examined the label. Then, with practiced efficiency, she opened it and tipped the contents into her palm. My fingers tightened around the iPad. What was she doing? I watched, unable to look away, as she reached into her pocket and withdrew another small container. She carefully poured what appeared to be identical pills from this container into my prescription bottle, then returned a few of my original pills on top. The entire process took less than a minute. She secured the cap, placed the bottle exactly as she'd found it, and left the room. The recording ended. I sat frozen, the iPad heavy in my suddenly cold hands. My heart pounded painfully against my ribs. Each beat a hammer strike. I replayed the footage 3 times, hoping desperately I'd misinterpreted what I'd seen. But each viewing only confirmed the terrible truth. My daughter-in-law had been tampering with my medication. The realization hit me with physical force. She wasn't just stealing from me. She was trying to harm me. Possibly trying to kill me. I stumbled to the bathroom, barely making it, before emptying the contents of my stomach. Bracing myself against the cool porcelain, I tried to steady my breathing. My mind raced through recent events, my increasing fatigue, the dizzy spells I'd mentioned to Michael, the way my hands had begun to tremble. Symptoms I'd attributed to age, but which now took on a sinister significance. How long had this been happening? What was she giving me instead of my prescribed medication? When I could stand again, I returned to my bedroom and stared at the innocent-looking orange bottle on my nightstand. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. Vanessa had been part of our family for 12 years. She'd held Margaret's hand during her final days. She'd helped plan her funeral. She'd brought meals and checked on me daily in those first dark months of widowhood. I'd trusted her completely. loved her like a daughter. I sank onto the edge of my bed, the weight of this discovery pressing down on me like a physical burden. My hands shook as I picked up my phone, then set it down again. Who could I call? What would I say? I think my daughter-in-law is poisoning me. It sounded paranoid, delusional. Would anyone believe me? Would Michael? I needed proof beyond this single video, and I needed to understand why. What could possibly motivate Vanessa to do this? As the shock began to give way to a cold, clear anger, I realized I would need to be careful, methodical. I would need to gather more evidence before confronting what was happening in my own home. And most importantly, I would need to protect myself while I figured out exactly what Vanessa was trying to do to me. And why? The hospital room was unnaturally quiet at 3 a.m. Only the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes in the hallway broke the silence. I'd been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events that had landed me here 4 days earlier. The cardiac episode, as Dr. Levine called it. Not quite a heart attack, but serious enough to warrant immediate hospitalization and a battery of tests that left me feeling like a human pincushion. I reached for the small paper cup on my bedside table and studied the 2 pills inside. One white, one pale blue. The same medication I'd been taking at home for the past 6 months to manage my blood pressure. Except these pills looked different. The hospital-issued medication was slightly larger, with different markings. I'd noticed the discrepancy yesterday morning, but had been too groggy from whatever they'd given me to think clearly about it. Now, in the stillness of night, the difference seemed glaring, impossible to ignore. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the Ziploc bag containing my personal effects. Among them was the small weekly pill organizer Margaret had insisted I use. "You're getting forgetful, Dad," she'd said with that concerned daughter look she'd perfected. "This way you won't miss doses." I'd acquiesced, partly because she was right about my occasional forgetfulness, but mostly because it seemed to ease her worry. For the past 3 months, she'd been filling it for me each Sunday evening. A daughter taking care of her aging father. That's how it had appeared. I emptied one compartment onto the hospital tray. The pills tumbled out, similar in color to my prescription, but not identical. I'd been taking blood pressure medication for 15 years and had never experienced the symptoms that had plagued me recently. Dizziness, confusion, fatigue that seemed to seep into my bones. Symptoms that had prompted Margaret to suggest moving in with her and Thomas temporarily while I recovered. Symptoms that had culminated in me collapsing in their guest bathroom 4 nights ago, my heart racing so erratically I'd been certain it would burst from my chest. "Your blood work showed some concerning anomalies," Dr. Levine had told me yesterday afternoon. She was a cardiologist in her 50s with direct eyes and a no-nonsense manner I appreciated. "Your potassium levels were dangerously low, and there were traces of a medication that shouldn't have been in your system at all. It's not consistent with what you reported taking." What would happen, I'd asked carefully, if someone took the wrong blood pressure medication? Or perhaps the wrong dosage? She'd looked at me sharply then. Depending on the medication and the person's condition, it could cause exactly what happened to you: arrhythmia, hypotension, confusion. In severe cases, it could lead to heart failure or stroke. She paused, studying my face. "Mr. Harmon, is there a reason you're asking this?" I'd deflected, claiming concern about pharmacy errors. But as night fell and visitors left, Margaret kissing my forehead, Thomas squeezing my shoulder with what now seemed like performative concern, the truth had crystallized with terrible clarity. The pills in my organizer weren't my prescribed medication. Someone had been systematically replacing my medication with something else. Someone with access to my home, my bathroom cabinet. Someone who stood to gain from my declining health, or perhaps from my death. The realization didn't come as a lightning bolt, but as a slow, cold wave washing over me. My son-in-law Thomas had been unusually interested in my financial affairs lately. 3 weeks ago, he'd casually mentioned the benefits of adding Margaret to my accounts, just in case something happens. 2 months before that, he'd brought paperwork for a power of attorney that I'd politely declined to sign, citing a desire to review it with my own attorney first. His smile had tightened then, though he'd quickly recovered. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of betrayal settle in my chest, heavier than any cardiac episode. The pieces aligned with terrible precision. My declining health coincided exactly with Margaret taking over my medication management. The suggestion I move in with them. Thomas's increasing questions about my investments, my property, my will. The $840,000 life insurance policy Margaret had encouraged me to maintain, with her as sole beneficiary after her mother passed. For peace of mind, she'd said. A nurse entered to check my vitals, her quiet efficiency a momentary distraction from the horror unfolding in my mind. "Everything okay, Mr. Harmon?" "Your heart rate's a bit elevated." "Just having trouble sleeping," I replied, carefully returning the pills to the bag and sliding it under my pillow. When she left, I lay back, forcing my breathing to slow. I'd always been methodical. It was what had made me successful in business for 42 years. Rash decisions and emotional outbursts weren't my style. Even now, with rage and hurt churning inside me, I knew better than to act impulsively. If I confronted them now, what proof did I have? A few pills that looked different? My word against theirs? They could claim a pharmacy error, confusion on my part, the forgetfulness they'd been subtly suggesting to others. No, confrontation would only alert them. They would be more careful, more deliberate. And I would be more vulnerable. As dawn broke, casting long shadows across the hospital room, I made a decision. I would say nothing for now. I would return to their home as planned, the concerned father grateful for his daughter's care. I would take the pills they gave me after palming them and disposing of them secretly. I would play the role of the declining old man while gathering evidence, consulting professionals who could help me understand exactly what had been done and how to prove it. I would be patient, thorough, and above all, careful. Dr. Levine visited later that morning, informing me I could be discharged the following day. "But I want to be absolutely clear, Mr. Harmon," she said, her voice low and serious. "If you had continued taking whatever was in your system, the outcome could have been fatal. You're fortunate the episode happened when it did." She hesitated, then added, "I've ordered a detailed toxicology screen. The results should be available in a few days. Would you like me to call you directly with the findings?" I nodded, thanking her for her thoroughness. As she left, I turned to look out the window at the hospital parking lot below, watching as visitors came and went. Somewhere out there, my daughter and her husband were going about their day, perhaps discussing what to do with my house once I was gone, how to access my accounts, how to split the insurance money. The thought should have broken me. Instead, it hardened something inside. I had built a life from nothing once before, after losing my wife to cancer 15 years ago. I had survived that unimaginable pain. I would survive this betrayal too, and I would ensure that those responsible faced consequences for what they had tried to do. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with and who I could trust to help me navigate the darkness ahead. When Brian first brought Melissa home to meet me, I was genuinely happy for him. After his mother passed away, I'd worried about him finding someone who would bring stability to his life. Melissa seemed perfect, bright, ambitious, and she made my son laugh in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. They married within a year, a modest ceremony that I gladly paid for. "Dad, we'll pay you back once we're settled," Brian had promised. I waved him off. "This is my gift to you both," I told him, writing a check for $22,000 without hesitation. That was the first of many checks I would write over the next decade. Brian had always struggled to find his footing career-wise. He'd bounced between jobs since college, 6 months at an insurance firm, a year in pharmaceutical sales, 8 months at a tech startup. Nothing seemed to stick. "I just haven't found my passion yet," he'd explained during our Sunday dinners. I understood. Not everyone finds their calling right away. I'd been fortunate to build my construction business from the ground up in my 20s, turning it into something substantial enough to provide a comfortable retirement. I wanted the same security for my son, and I was willing to help him get there. Their first real financial crisis came 3 years into their marriage. Brian had just lost another job, and Melissa discovered she was pregnant. They were living in a one-bedroom apartment, barely making rent. "We need to get into a house before the baby comes," Brian explained over coffee at my kitchen table. His eyes had that familiar, anxious look. "The bank wants a 20% down payment, Dad." "We've saved some, but—" He trailed off, staring into his mug. I didn't make him ask. The next day, I transferred $65,000 into their account. When they closed on the modest 3-bedroom in the suburbs a month later, Melissa hugged me tight at the signing. "We couldn't have done this without you," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "You've given our baby a home." Little Emma arrived 2 months later. And with her came unexpected complications. Melissa developed postpartum complications that required 2 additional surgeries. Their insurance covered most of it, but the deductibles and out-of-network specialists added up to nearly $30,000. Brian called me from the hospital, his voice cracking. "Dad, I don't know what to do." "They're talking about collections." I paid the bills that afternoon. "Family takes care of family," I told him when he tried to discuss repayment. "You focus on getting Melissa healthy and taking care of my granddaughter." For a while, things stabilized. Brian found work managing a retail store, not his dream job, but steady income. Melissa recovered and eventually went back to her administrative position part-time. I settled into the role of doting grandfather, watching Emma every Thursday while Melissa worked. Those were precious days, filled with trips to the park and messy baking sessions in my kitchen. During those early years, I noticed how Melissa would leave little thank you notes around my house. Once I found a handmade card from Emma with Melissa's careful writing. "Thank you for everything, Grandpa. We love you." I kept it in my desk drawer, a reminder of what family meant. The shift happened so gradually, I almost didn't notice it. When Emma was about 4, Brian decided to try starting his own business, a landscaping company. "I've learned from watching you, Dad," he said enthusiastically. "I want to build something of my own." I was proud of his ambition and wrote him a check for $40,000 as startup capital. 6 months later, he needed another $30,000 for equipment. By the end of the first year, I'd invested over $100,000. The business limped along for 18 months before folding. Brian was devastated. I assured him that failure was part of the journey. "Your first attempt didn't work out. That's okay. You'll find your way." Around this time, I began noticing changes in Melissa. The thank you notes stopped. When I visited their home, she'd mention renovations they wanted, or how Emma needed private school tuition because the public schools weren't good enough. Once, after I'd given them $8,000 to cover property taxes they'd fallen behind on, I overheard her on the phone with her sister. "It's the least he could do," she said, not realizing I was coming back from the bathroom. "He's sitting on a fortune while we're struggling." The words stung, but I told myself she was just stressed about their finances. Brian's next venture was a franchise opportunity that required a substantial investment. "This is different, Dad," he insisted over dinner at my house. "It's a proven business model." Melissa nodded eagerly beside him. "Brian has done all the research. The return on investment is practically guaranteed." I had my doubts but wanted to believe in my son. I liquidated one of my investment accounts and loaned them $120,000. When I suggested drawing up a simple repayment agreement just to keep things organized, Melissa's expression hardened. "Don't you trust us?" she asked. Brian quickly intervened. "Of course Dad trusts us. He's just being thorough." But I saw something in Melissa's eyes that troubled me, a flash of calculation that hadn't been there in the early years. The franchise failed within 2 years. By then, I'd sunk another $50,000 into keeping it afloat. Brian was 42 years old and starting over again. During this period, their requests became more frequent and less apologetic. When their roof needed replacing, Melissa called and simply said, "The roofer needs $18,000 by Friday." No pleas, no acknowledgement of the mounting debt they'd never repaid. When Emma needed braces, the bill appeared in my email with a text from Brian. "Can you handle this? Things are tight this month." That month turned into years of things being tight. The realization came to me on my 73rd birthday. They'd organized a small dinner at their house, the house I'd helped them buy, with the new kitchen I'd paid to remodel, and the swimming pool I'd financed as a gift to Emma. As I sat at the head of the table, I noticed how Brian and Melissa exchanged glances when I mentioned my upcoming appointment with my financial advisor. Later, when I was helping clear dishes, I overheard them in the pantry. "Did you see his hands shaking?" Melissa whispered. "The doctor said his father had Parkinson's too. We need to talk to him about putting the house in our names before things get worse." Brian's response was too quiet to hear, but he didn't disagree. I stood there, dinner plates growing heavy in my hands, as the truth settled over me like a cold shadow. They weren't waiting for me to recover from my recent health scare. They were waiting for me to die. In their eyes, I had transformed from father and grandfather into nothing more than an obstacle between them and what they believed they deserved. That night, driving home alone, I calculated roughly how much I'd given them over the years. Nearly $500,000 in gifts, loans, and direct support. Not once had they repaid a single dollar. As I pulled into my driveway, I realized I needed to take a hard look at my will and what protections I had in place. If they saw me as nothing more than a walking inheritance, I needed to understand exactly what they might be planning. The thought of investigating my own son filled me with a sadness so profound it felt physical, like a stone lodged beneath my ribs. But I couldn't ignore what I'd heard, or the pattern of behavior that had been building for years. I met Frank Donovan at a small coffee shop 15 miles from my neighborhood. I'd chosen the location carefully, somewhere Patricia would never go. Frank was a retired police detective who now ran a private investigation firm. He had the weathered face of someone who'd seen too much and the steady eyes of someone who could handle whatever came next. I'd found him through my attorney, who assured me of his discretion. At 73, I never imagined I'd be hiring a private investigator to look into my own family. but here I was, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "I need to know everything about my daughter-in-law," I said, keeping my voice low despite the ambient chatter around us. "Her background, her activities over the past 3 years, her finances, anything that might explain what's been happening." I explained my suspicions about Patricia, the mysterious episodes I'd been having, and my growing certainty that she was somehow involved. Frank didn't react with surprise or judgment. He simply nodded, jotted notes in a small leather-bound notebook, and asked precise questions about Patricia's habits, schedule, and background. "This type of investigation takes time, Mr. Harmon," he said, "and it won't be cheap. We're looking at 3 to 4 weeks minimum, possibly $8,000 to $12,000, depending on how deep we need to go." I didn't hesitate. The money meant nothing compared to what was at stake. I wrote him a check for $5,000 as a retainer, and we agreed to communicate only through a secure email address he set up for me. As I watched him leave, I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The wheels were now in motion. 2 weeks passed with only brief updates from Frank. I used the time to begin my own investigation at home. I ordered copies of my bank statements going back 3 years, paper copies, delivered to a P.O. box I'd rented. When they arrived, I spread them across my desk in the guest bedroom I'd converted to an office, door locked. What I found made my stomach turn. There was a pattern to the withdrawals, $2,000 here, $30,500 there, all occurring within days of my episodes. Over 3 years, the total approached $78,000. I remembered authorizing none of them. I documented each suspicious transaction in a spreadsheet, noting dates and amounts, and cross-referenced them with my calendar and medical records. Frank's first substantial report arrived by encrypted email on a Tuesday morning. I printed it at the library rather than at home and read it in my car, hands trembling slightly as I turned the pages. Patricia Miller, née Sanderson, had a history that didn't match the story she'd told our family. She'd been married briefly before meeting my son, something she'd never mentioned. She'd claimed to come from old money in Boston, but Frank had traced her to a middle-class family in Tucson. Most disturbing was her financial situation. Despite her careful appearance of affluence, she was drowning in debt, credit cards maxed out, personal loans in collection, and a gambling problem that Frank had documented with photographs of her entering casinos in 3 different states over the past month, alone. "Call me when you've reviewed this," Frank had written at the end of the report. I did, from a payphone at a gas station. "There's more," he said when I reached him. "I've been looking into her family history. Did you know her aunt died under suspicious circumstances 6 years ago?" I hadn't known Patricia even had an aunt. Frank explained that Eleanor Sanderson, Patricia's maternal aunt, had died at 78 after a series of accidents at home. She'd changed her will 3 months before her death, leaving Patricia approximately $240,000. The police had investigated but found insufficient evidence to pursue charges. "The pattern is similar," Frank said, his voice matter-of-fact. "The aunt had unexplained falls, confusion, memory issues. Medical examiner found nothing conclusive. But I spoke with a former neighbor who had concerns. Said Patricia was suddenly around all the time after years of no contact, handling the old lady's medications, controlling who visited." The parallel to my situation was unmistakable. I asked Frank to dig deeper into Eleanor Sanderson's death and to obtain Patricia's phone records if possible. "Already working on it," he assured me. Over the next week, I became a detective in my own home. I installed a small camera in my study, hidden among my books. I began keeping a detailed journal of my meals, noting when Patricia prepared food for me and how I felt afterward. I purchased a small safe with a combination only I knew and stored my new documentation there, along with copies of my will and financial records. I even started taking daily photographs of my pill organizer with my phone, documenting exactly what medications I was supposedly taking. Frank's final report arrived 3 days later. It was comprehensive and damning. Patricia had been visiting online forums discussing untraceable poisons and elder care. Her phone records showed calls to 3 different attorneys specializing in estate law. Most chilling was what Frank had discovered about Eleanor Sanderson's death. He'd located a former home health aide who had been fired after questioning why Patricia was administering unmarked medications to her aunt. The aide had reported her concerns, but by the time authorities followed up, Eleanor was already dead and cremated, at Patricia's insistence, despite the family having a burial plot. That evening, I sat in my study reviewing everything, bank statements, Frank's reports, my own notes, and assembled them into a comprehensive file. The evidence was overwhelming. Patricia wasn't just stealing from me, she was systematically poisoning me, creating these episodes to gain control of my finances while setting the stage for my eventual death. The realization should have terrified me, but instead I felt an odd calm. Knowledge was power. I now understood what I was facing, and that meant I could fight back. I placed everything in my safe, then sat down to compose an email to my attorney. We needed to meet immediately. The time for investigation was over. Now I needed to decide exactly how to protect myself and make Patricia answer for what she'd done. I'd known Martin for over 20 years. He'd guided me through my retirement planning, helped me navigate the market crash of 2008, and advised me on the trust fund I'd established for Andrew. His office hadn't changed much over the decades. The same mahogany desk, the framed certificates on the wall, the family photos that gradually showed his children growing up and eventually his grandchildren appearing. I'd always found comfort in that consistency. But on that Tuesday morning in April, as I sat across from him with a manila folder containing my evidence, I knew nothing would ever feel the same again. "Frank, I've been reviewing everything you sent over," Martin said, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. "These withdrawals from your accounts are concerning, to say the least. But before we go further, I need to show you something else." He turned to his computer, typing quickly before swiveling the monitor toward me. "I pulled your son's financial records after your call. As his secondary financial advisor, and with the permissions you both granted years ago, I have visibility into his accounts. I wasn't sure if it was relevant, but now I think it might be." The screen showed Andrew's financial dashboard. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. His salary deposits from the architectural firm appeared regular, mortgage payments consistent. But as Martin clicked through to other screens, my stomach began to tighten. There were large withdrawals, sometimes $5,000 or $8,000 at a time, often made late at night or in the early morning hours. Many were from ATMs in or near casinos. Over the past 18 months, the pattern had accelerated dramatically. "How much?" I asked, my voice barely audible even to myself. Martin removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "By my calculation, Andrew has withdrawn approximately $187,000 from his accounts in the past year and a half. His savings are nearly depleted. There have been cash advances against credit cards, a home equity line of credit against the house you helped them buy." He paused, looking at me with genuine concern. "Frank, these are classic patterns I've seen before. The timing, the locations, the escalating amounts." "Gambling," I said, the word falling from my mouth like a stone. My son, my Andrew, the boy who'd been so cautious with his allowance that he'd saved for months to buy a new bicycle. The young man who'd worked summers during college to avoid taking out more student loans than necessary. The father who talked about saving for my granddaughter's education. Are you certain? The evidence is compelling. Look at these withdrawals. Foxwoods Casino at 2:14 a.m., Mohegan Sun at 11:47 p.m., online transfers to accounts that appear to be offshore betting sites. Martin scrolled through more transactions. And there's more, Frank. There are 3 personal loans taken out in the past 8 months. High interest rates, the kind that suggest desperation or poor credit. He clicked to another screen. And this is what concerns me most in relation to your situation. The screen showed transfers from Andrew's account to Rebecca's. Large sums, $12,000, $18,000, $9,500, with vague memos like house fund or investment. But what made my hands grip the armrests of my chair until my knuckles whitened was the timing. Each of these transfers occurred within days of the suspicious withdrawals from my accounts. The timing can't be coincidental, Martin said, his professional demeanor cracking slightly as he connected the dots. Frank, I hate to suggest this, but it appears Andrew may have been funneling money to Rebecca, who then... He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Who then transferred it to herself from my accounts, I finished for him. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I'd come here believing Rebecca had betrayed me, had somehow manipulated my accounts without Andrew's knowledge. That had been painful enough. But this suggested my own son was complicit. My only child, the boy I'd raised alone after his mother died, the young man I'd put through college, helped buy his first home, the father of my only grandchild. He knew, I whispered. He had to have known. Martin pushed a box of tissues toward me, though I hadn't realized tears had formed. There's one more thing, he said gently. 2 weeks ago, Andrew came to see me. He asked about the possibility of becoming a co-trustee on your estate. He mentioned concerns about your memory, said you'd been forgetting things. He suggested it might be time to transition some control to him for your protection. Martin's expression hardened slightly. I told him we'd need proper medical documentation and your consent. He seemed frustrated by that response. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. Not only had my son likely enabled the theft of my money, but he'd been laying groundwork to take control of everything else. I thought of our Sunday dinners, how he'd occasionally ask if I was keeping track of things okay, or mention articles about elderly financial abuse, all while he was the one abusing my trust. I remembered how he'd given Rebecca my banking passwords to help organize my finances after I'd mentioned having trouble with the online system. The pieces fit together with devastating clarity. Frank, I've known you and Andrew for decades. I attended his college graduation. This is... Martin shook his head, visibly shaken. This is beyond anything I could have imagined. I'm required by law to report suspected elder financial abuse, but I wanted to speak with you first. These are serious allegations against your own son. I stared at the financial statements spread across Martin's desk, the evidence of my son's gambling addiction and his betrayal laid out in columns of numbers and timestamps. Each figure represented not just money taken, but trust destroyed. I thought about little Emma, my granddaughter, who would be caught in the middle of whatever came next. The family photo on my mantel flashed in my mind, the 3 of them smiling, Andrew's arm around Rebecca, Emma giggling in front. A family built on a foundation that was now crumbling. I need time, I finally said, gathering the papers with trembling hands. Before you file any reports, I need to understand the full extent of this. And I need to decide what to do about my son. The word son caught in my throat. As I stood to leave, Martin came around his desk and put a hand on my shoulder, a gesture so unexpected from my usually formal advisor that it nearly broke what composure I had left. I knew I needed to think clearly now, despite the heartbreak threatening to overwhelm me. The drive home would give me time to consider my next steps, though I already knew this betrayal required more than just financial damage control. I would need legal advice, and soon. Looking back, the warning signs were as bright as traffic lights. But grief has a way of dimming your vision, of making you reach for any hand extended in your direction. After Martha passed, I was adrift in our too-large house, surrounded by 43 years of shared memories, and suddenly responsible for all the little things she had managed so effortlessly. When Diane offered to help, I saw only kindness in her gesture. My son Michael's wife had always been polite if somewhat distant at family gatherings. Now she was offering to check in on me 3 times a week, to help manage my medications, to drive me to appointments. How could I have known her helpfulness was merely the opening move in a carefully orchestrated game? "Dad, your blood pressure medication needs to be organized," she'd said about 2 months after Martha's funeral. "You're getting older, and we can't have you mixing things up." She arrived the next day with one of those plastic pill organizers with little compartments for each day of the week. "I'll fill this every Sunday," she announced, not asked. "It'll be one less thing for you to worry about." I remember feeling a flicker of annoyance. I'd managed my own medications for years, but I swallowed my pride. After all, she was making time for me when she had 2 teenagers and her real estate business to manage. I handed over my 5 prescription bottles without protest. Within 3 weeks of Diane taking over my medication management, I began experiencing unusual symptoms. Dizziness in the mornings that sometimes lasted until noon. Confusion that would descend without warning, making simple tasks like balancing my checkbook suddenly impossible. Fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to cure. I mentioned these symptoms to Dr. Kaplan, who ordered blood tests and adjusted my medications. "Sometimes grief manifests physically," he explained gently. "And your body is still adjusting to the new blood pressure medication." I accepted his explanation without question. Why wouldn't I? He was my doctor of 20 years. There was an afternoon in April. I remember because the cherry blossoms were in full bloom outside my living room window, when Michael stopped by unexpectedly. Diane had just left after dropping off groceries and organizing my pills for the week. I was sitting in Martha's old reading chair, trying to focus on the newspaper, but feeling that now familiar fog settling over my mind. Michael found me staring blankly at the same page I'd been trying to read for 30 minutes. "Dad? Are you okay?" His voice seemed to come from far away. When I finally focused on his face, I saw concern etched in the lines around his eyes so much like his mother's. "You don't look right." "Just tired," I mumbled. "Diane was just here. She brought groceries." I gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. Michael walked to the pill organizer on the counter and picked it up, examining it with a frown. "Has she been managing all your medications?" "For a couple months now." "She's been a godsend." The words felt thick in my mouth. I remember how Michael's shoulders tensed, how he set the pill container down with deliberate care. "Dad, are you sure that's a good idea? You've always been so independent." "Your wife offered," I said, a defensive edge creeping into my voice. "She's just trying to help." Michael opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. He glanced at his watch. "I should go. Diane's expecting me home for dinner." He hesitated at the door. "Just call me if you need anything, okay?" "Anything at all." I didn't recognize it then, but that hesitation, that unspoken concern, It was the first time I'd seen my son afraid to speak freely in his childhood home. Now I understand he was caught between loyalty to his wife and worry for his father. And I, in my medicated haze, had missed it completely. The missing items started small, so small I questioned my own memory rather than considering theft. Martha's silver letter opener disappeared from my desk. A pair of gold cufflinks she'd given me on our 25th anniversary vanished from my dresser drawer. My grandfather's pocket watch, which I'd planned to give Michael someday, was suddenly nowhere to be found. Each time I tore the house apart looking, only to eventually convince myself I must have misplaced them. "You're getting older," I told myself. "These things happen." But they didn't just happen. They were happening systematically every few weeks, always after Diane had been in the house alone. Then came the questions about my finances. Casual at first, inquiries about how I was managing the bills, whether I'd considered simplifying my accounts. "Michael and I worry about you handling all this alone," she'd say, gesturing to the stack of mail on my desk. "I manage our household finances. I'd be happy to help organize yours." When I politely declined, explaining that I'd been handling my own money since before she was born, her smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened momentarily. 2 days later, I received a call from my bank asking if I'd authorized someone to access my account information. I hadn't. The most damning red flag came during a Sunday dinner at their house, about 7 months after Diane had appointed herself my caregiver. She'd served pot roast, Martha's recipe she claimed, though it tasted nothing like my wife's cooking. As Michael cleared the plates, Diane leaned across the table. "Frank," she said, using my first name, though I'd never invited such familiarity, "have you updated your will since Martha passed?" The question landed like a stone in still water. It's just that these things should be in order. For Michael's sake. Michael returned just then, catching the tail end of her question. His hands froze in the act of collecting water glasses. "Diane, Jesus. That's not—" He stopped himself, shooting me an apologetic look. "Dad doesn't need to worry about that right now." "I'm just being practical," she replied, her tone suddenly honeyed. "Someone has to think about these things." She patted my hand with cold fingers. "We want to make sure you're taken care of, Frank. And that everything goes smoothly after." I watched my son's face as she spoke. His discomfort was palpable, his eyes darting between us before fixing on the tablecloth. He said nothing more, just continued clearing dishes with mechanical precision. Later, as he walked me to my car, I thought he might say something, explain or apologize for his wife's inappropriate question. Instead, he hugged me tightly, holding on a beat too long. "I love you, Dad," he said, his voice strained. Then he stepped back, glancing toward the house where Diane stood, silhouetted in the doorway. How did I miss what was happening? Perhaps I didn't want to see it. Perhaps I couldn't bear the thought that my son had married someone capable of such calculated deception. Or perhaps, most shamefully, I was simply grateful not to be alone, even if my company had ulterior motives. Whatever the reason, I ignored every warning sign, every red flag that should have sent me running for help. Instead, I handed over my pills, my house keys, and very nearly my future to a woman who saw me not as family, but as an obstacle to overcome. An obstacle between her and whatever she thought I had that she deserved. As my mind gradually cleared in the weeks after I stopped taking the pills Diane had been organizing for me, I began to piece together the extent of her manipulation. The convenient health declines after her visits. The missing valuables. The financial probing. The will questions. And through it all, my son's silent discomfort, his inability to confront the woman he'd married. I had been blind, but now I was beginning to see with painful clarity. And what I saw demanded action, not just to protect myself, but to save my son from the web he seemed unable to escape on his own. I called Dr. Raymond Chen first thing Monday morning. Ray and I had worked together at Memorial Hospital for nearly 15 years before my retirement. As the head toxicologist, he'd helped me solve countless puzzling cases when patients arrived with unexplained symptoms. If anyone could identify the mysterious pills I'd found in Margaret's purse, it would be Ray. Walter? It's been what, 3 years? Ray's voice carried the same energetic tone I remembered. We exchanged brief pleasantries before I explained my situation, carefully omitting names and my suspicions about Margaret's intentions. I simply told him I'd found unfamiliar medication in my home and wanted to understand what it was, particularly how it might interact with my heart medication. "Can you bring them by the lab this afternoon?" "Around 2?" Ray asked. "I've got a gap in my schedule then." I agreed, relieved he hadn't pressed for more details. The less people who knew about my family situation, the better. The hospital hadn't changed much since my days there. The same antiseptic smell, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the hushed voices. Ray's lab was tucked away in the basement, a sterile environment filled with equipment that had grown more sophisticated since my time. He greeted me with a firm handshake, his salt and pepper hair now more salt than pepper. "Let's see what you've got," he said, gesturing to a stool beside his workstation. I placed the plastic bag containing 3 different pills on the counter. Ray slipped on gloves and carefully examined each one, occasionally referencing a database on his computer. The methodical process took nearly 40 minutes, during which he asked pointed questions about my current medications and dosages. "Well, Walter, I can tell you exactly what these are, and I don't like what I'm seeing." Ray's expression had grown increasingly grave. "This white one is amiodarone, a powerful antiarrhythmic. This blue capsule contains verapamil, a calcium channel blocker. And this small yellow one is digoxin." He leaned back in his chair. "All 3 are heart medications, but none of them should be taken with the beta blockers you're already prescribed. The combination would create dangerous drug interactions." "What kind of interactions?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Potentially fatal ones," Ray said bluntly. "Taking these alongside your current regimen would cause bradycardia, dangerously slow heart rate, and could lead to heart block or even cardiac arrest. The effects wouldn't be immediate, though. They'd build up gradually, over weeks." He studied my face. "Walter, if someone were taking these without proper medical supervision, especially someone with your cardiac history, they'd experience increasing fatigue, dizziness, confusion, perhaps fainting spells. To the untrained eye, even to some physicians, it might appear as natural deterioration in someone your age, particularly if the pills were being administered intermittently, creating a pattern of decline with occasional improvements." The clinical description matched exactly what I'd been experiencing over the past 2 months. The fatigue I'd attributed to age, the dizzy spells that had prompted Margaret's insistence I use a cane, the confusion that had led to her suggestion that perhaps I should consider relinquishing control of our finances for my own peace of mind. It hadn't been age at all. It had been poison, administered slowly, methodically, by the woman I'd trusted most. "Walter," Ray's voice pulled me back, "these aren't over-the-counter medications. They require prescriptions. Where did you say you found them?" "I didn't," I replied, carefully maintaining my composure. "But I appreciate your help identifying them." I gathered the pills back into the plastic bag. "One more question. If someone were deliberately administering these to cause harm, would it be detectable in a toxicology screen?" Ray's eyebrows rose. It would, yes, but only if the test were specifically looking for these compounds. A standard tox screen might miss them, especially if doses were small and intermittent. He paused, studying me with the sharp gaze that had made him an excellent diagnostician. "Walter, if you're concerned someone is being harmed, we should contact the authorities." "That's my next stop," I assured him, which wasn't entirely a lie. 2 hours later, I sat across from Officer Daniels at the police station. She was younger than my daughter, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. I'd laid out everything: the pills, Ray's analysis, my suspicions about Margaret, and the evidence of her affair with my financial advisor. Officer Daniels took meticulous notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Mr. Harrison, I understand your concerns, and I want to be straightforward with you," she said finally. "What you're describing, attempted poisoning through medication interactions, is extremely serious. However, proving intent in cases like this is extraordinarily difficult without direct evidence." "I have the pills," I pointed out, "and Dr. Chen's analysis." "Yes, but your wife could claim she was confused about your medications, or that she got them from a doctor who didn't know your full medical history. Without a confession or clear evidence of intent, like text messages discussing the plan or a witness, the district attorney would be unlikely to pursue charges." She leaned forward. "We can certainly investigate, but I want you to have realistic expectations. These cases rarely result in convictions unless we have something concrete." I nodded, feeling a cold certainty settle over me. The justice system, with its burden of proof and presumption of innocence, would not help me. Margaret was too careful, too calculating. There would be no smoking gun, no convenient confession. "What would you recommend I do in the meantime?" I asked. "Stay somewhere else if possible. Document everything. And most importantly, don't confront her directly. That could escalate the situation." Officer Daniels handed me her card. "Call me any time if you feel you're in danger or if you discover more evidence." I thanked her and left, the weight of her words settling on my shoulders. As I drove home, I realized I'd reached a crossroads. The legal system couldn't, or wouldn't, protect me. Margaret would continue draining our accounts while slowly poisoning me, all while maintaining her facade of the devoted wife caring for her declining husband. By the time anyone believed me, it would be too late. Stopped at a red light, I made my decision. If the system couldn't deliver justice, I would have to create my own. Not through violence, I'd never been that kind of man, but through careful planning and execution of a different sort. Margaret had taught me something valuable. Sometimes the most effective weapon is patience. I would need to document everything, gather irrefutable evidence, and then orchestrate a reckoning that would leave her no escape. As the light turned green, I felt a strange calm replace my anger. I had been a respected surgeon for 40 years. I knew how to be methodical, how to work with precision. Now I would apply those skills to saving my own life and reclaiming what was rightfully mine. For 3 nights, I barely slept. I'd lie awake in my bedroom, the same one I'd shared with Margaret for 42 years before cancer took her, staring at the ceiling fan's slow rotation. The betrayal sat like a stone in my chest. My own flesh and blood. My son, Robert, and daughter-in-law, Elaine, had systematically worked to strip me of everything I'd built over a lifetime. The $212,000 from the investment account. The lake house deed. The emergency loans that were never meant to be repaid. And now their plan to have me declared incompetent so they could access the remainder of my estate. On the 4th morning, I rose at 5:30 a.m., made a pot of coffee, and sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. I drew a line down the middle. On the left side, I wrote, "Family loyalty." On the right, "Justice." Under family loyalty, I wrote Robert's name. I added the memory of holding him as a newborn, teaching him to fish at the lake when he was 7, helping him move into his college dorm, standing beside him at his wedding. Under justice, I listed the evidence of their betrayal: the forged checks, the manipulated power of attorney document, the whispered phone conversations I'd overheard between Robert and Elaine about accelerating the timeline once they discovered I'd caught on to their scheme. "What would you do, Margaret?" I whispered to the empty chair across from me. In our marriage, she had been the compassionate one, always finding the good in people. But she also had a steel core when it came to right and wrong. I could almost hear her response. "Henry, loving someone doesn't mean letting them destroy themselves. Or you." I considered my options. I could confront them directly, sit Robert and Elaine down, and lay out everything I knew. But what would that accomplish? The rehearsed denials, the tearful accusations that I was confused or paranoid, the damage to my relationship with my grandchildren, who would inevitably be caught in the middle. And most importantly, nothing would be recovered. The money they'd already taken would remain gone. I could go to the police. Financial elder abuse is a crime, after all. I had evidence, not enough for an airtight case perhaps, but enough to start an investigation. I pictured Robert in handcuffs, my son's name in the local paper, my grandchildren watching their father being taken away. The scandal would ripple through our community, where I'd built a reputation over decades. The Wilsons would become that family. And even if he was convicted, would I feel whole? Would justice be served by destroying what remained of my family? I poured another cup of coffee and walked to the window. The morning light filtered through the oak tree Margaret had planted the year we moved in. 53 years it had grown, weathering storms, disease, and that lightning strike in '97 that nearly split it in two. Yet here it stood, scarred but stronger for having survived. I felt a clarity begin to settle over me. This wasn't about anger, though God knows I felt it. This wasn't about hurt, though the pain was real. This was about consequences, about ensuring that actions had appropriate outcomes, about protecting myself, and in a way I was only beginning to understand, protecting Robert and Elaine from the people they were becoming. The kind of people who would steal from an aging parent, who would manipulate and lie without remorse. If I did nothing, what message would that send? That betrayal carries no cost? That ethics are flexible when money is involved? I returned to the table and wrote a third column. Plan. My hand was steady as I began to outline what needed to be done. I would not yell. I would not threaten. I would not expose them publicly if it could be avoided. Instead, I would use the very thing that had corrupted them, their greed, as the mechanism of justice. I would create a situation where their own actions would reveal their true characters and intentions, where they would have to choose, openly and definitively, between decency and avarice. And in making that choice, they would either redeem themselves or face consequences of their own making. By noon, I had the framework. It would require patience, precision, a willingness to appear vulnerable when I was anything but. I would need help, trustworthy help, from people with expertise I lacked. It would cost me some of the money I had left, but I calculated it as an investment in my remaining years of peace. In my legacy? As I reviewed my notes, I felt no triumph, no vindictive pleasure. Just a solemn responsibility. I thought of my father, who'd taught me that a man's word was his bond. Of Margaret, who believed in second chances but not in enabling destructive behavior. I thought of my grandchildren, who deserve to grow up understanding that character matters, that there are lines you don't cross, even for money. especially for money. I closed the legal pad and put it in my desk drawer. Tomorrow I would make my first phone call to James, my old friend from the bank who'd retired to start his own financial investigation firm. I would need documentation, witnesses, and professional guidance to ensure my plan stayed within legal boundaries. I had no interest in becoming what I despised. But I had every right, perhaps even a duty, to protect what was mine and to ensure that those who sought to take advantage of me faced appropriate consequences. Not out of vengeance, but out of a commitment to justice and truth. The path ahead was clear now, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight on my chest begin to lift. I sat in Richard Keller's office, my trusted estate attorney for over 20 years, watching as he leaned back in his leather chair and processed everything I'd just told him. The morning sun filtered through his blinds, casting stripes across the polished mahogany desk between us. Richard was 68, 5 years my senior, with a full head of silver hair and the kind of measured demeanor that came from decades of handling delicate family matters. "Let me make sure I understand correctly, Howard," he said, removing his glasses. "You want to create 2 separate wills. The first, a public one, leaving virtually everything to your daughter-in-law, Melissa. And a second, private will that activates under specific conditions and redistributes your assets according to your actual wishes." He paused, studying my face. "This is unusual." "I know it sounds extreme," I replied, my voice steady despite the churning in my stomach. "But I've shown you the evidence. The recordings, the bank statements, the text messages between Melissa and my son. They're systematically isolating me, documenting every minor memory lapse, and building a case for incompetency." I leaned forward. "I need to protect what I've built over 50 years, Richard. Not just for me, but for the people who actually deserve it." Richard nodded slowly. "The evidence is compelling. I'll grant you that. And yes, we can create this arrangement legally. The public will would be superseded by the private one, which we can structure to activate automatically if certain conditions are met." He pulled out a yellow legal pad. "Let's be specific about those conditions." For the next 2 hours, we crafted what I came to think of as my revenge plan, though Richard preferred the term asset protection strategy. The public will would leave my primary residence worth $875,000, my investment portfolio valued at approximately $2.3 million, and my classic car collection to Melissa. My son would receive a token inheritance of $50,000, just enough to prevent him from contesting the will on grounds of being forgotten. This document would be filed with Richard's office and would be the one my family would initially discover. The real will, however, was far more complex. It would activate automatically if any legal action was taken against me regarding competency, if any attempt was made to access my accounts without authorization, or upon my death. This document redistributed my wealth dramatically. 40% to my brother's children, who had always shown me genuine affection. 35% to 3 charities I'd supported throughout my life. 15% to my former business partner's widow, who had fallen on hard times. And the remaining 10% to my housekeeper Maria's college fund for her twins. Melissa and my son would receive exactly nothing. "Now for the financial instruments," Richard said, sliding a different form across the desk. "You mentioned wanting to create assets that appear valuable but contain conditions." I nodded. "I want to establish a trust that seems to hold substantial assets, let's say $500,000, with Melissa as the apparent beneficiary. But I want conditions that essentially nullify it if certain behaviors occur." Richard drafted language creating what he called a conditional trust that would dissolve if the beneficiary engaged in any legal action against me or if evidence emerged of attempts to have me declared incompetent. The trust would appear solid on paper, something Melissa would discover during her inevitable snooping, but would be structured to evaporate like morning dew if she continued down her current path. "What about the cameras?" I asked as we finalized the paperwork. "I need documentation of what's happening in my home." "That's not my area of expertise," Richard admitted, "but I have a client who specializes in home security. Retired police detective. He's discreet and thorough." He wrote down a name and number. "Call Jim tomorrow. Tell him I referred you." 3 days later, Jim Hargrove spent 6 hours at my house while Melissa and my son were at their weekly tennis lesson. A stocky man with calloused hands and observant eyes, Jim installed 8 hidden cameras throughout my home, one in the kitchen where Melissa often reorganized my medications, one in my study where financial documents were stored, one in the living room where they often cornered me with their concerns about my memory, and others strategically placed to capture their behavior when they thought no one was watching. The system uploaded to a secure cloud server that only Jim and I could access. "These are legal in your own home," Jim explained as he showed me how to access the footage on my tablet. "But the recordings won't be admissible in court unless all parties consent to being recorded. Still, they'll give you documentation of what's happening, and sometimes just knowing the truth is half the battle." The final piece of my plan involved creating what Richard called honeypot documents, financial statements and account information that would be tantalizingly visible in my home office. These documents suggested I had recently moved $350,000 into an accessible account and was considering making Melissa the co-signer for convenience. In reality, this account contained only $15,000, and any attempt to access it would trigger notifications to both me and Richard. As I drove home from my final meeting with Richard, signed documents secure in my briefcase, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and resolve. The man I once was, trusting, generous, open-hearted, had been replaced by someone calculating and vigilant. I didn't recognize myself anymore, but then again, I no longer recognized my son either. The boy I'd taught to fish, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose college education I'd funded without hesitation, was now a stranger plotting against me. Perhaps we were both playing roles we never imagined for ourselves. That evening, I carefully placed the honeypot documents in my desk drawer, not hidden, but not obviously displayed either. Just visible enough to be discovered by someone snooping. Then I checked the camera feeds on my tablet, watching as tiny green lights indicated all systems were operational. The trap was set. Now I needed to give Melissa and my son enough rope to hang themselves, enough evidence of their betrayal that even they couldn't deny it when the moment of truth arrived. I went to bed that night thinking about the dinner I'd invited them to next week, the dinner where I would casually mention my appointment with my estate attorney and watch their reactions through the unblinking electronic eyes I'd installed throughout my home. The morning after my conversation with Detective Reeves, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The path forward was set, but I needed to secure every possible angle. My children thought they were dealing with a deteriorating old man who would eventually surrender his assets without a fight. I decided to use that misconception to my advantage. When Rebecca called to check in, I deliberately slurred my words slightly and mentioned I'd forgotten to take my blood pressure medication. Her voice perked up immediately. "Dad, you need to be more careful," she said, concern dripping from her voice like honey. "Maybe we should talk about getting you some help around the house." I mumbled something non-committal and let her believe her plan was working. After hanging up, I straightened my posture and made 3 important calls to my bank, my attorney, and a security company I'd researched extensively. At First National, I met with Mary Ann Decker, the branch manager I'd known for 15 years. I'd deliberately worn my oldest sweater, left my hair uncombed, and walked with a slight shuffle. As we sat in her office, I leaned forward and spoke quietly. "Marianne, I need to make some changes to my accounts. I'm concerned about unauthorized access." Her eyes widened slightly as I explained the situation. I showed her the documentation I'd gathered, the forged signatures, the suspicious withdrawals, the text messages between my children discussing how to manage Dad's finances. "Mr. Harmon, this is troubling," she said, reviewing the evidence. "What would you like to do?" I requested removal of all secondary access to my accounts, implementation of two-factor authentication for any transactions over $500, and creation of a new account only she would know about. I transferred $175,000 to this new account, enough to live on comfortably for at least 2 years if things went sideways. "And one more thing," I added, "I'd like a record of anyone who inquires about my accounts, even if they don't gain access." She nodded, her expression a mixture of sympathy and determination. "We'll set up alerts to your phone immediately." That afternoon, a technician from Sentinel Security arrived at my house. I'd paid extra for same-day service and discretion. "I need comprehensive surveillance," I explained as he surveyed my property. Inside and outside the house with remote access to the footage. He raised an eyebrow, but asked no questions as he installed cameras at my front and back doors, in my home office, and in the living room. The cameras were small, barely noticeable, unless you knew what to look for. He showed me how to access the feeds from my phone and computer and how to save and download footage. "The system backs up to cloud storage automatically," he explained. "Even if someone destroys the physical cameras, you'll have the footage." I paid him $3,200 in cash, plus a $500 tip for his efficiency and discretion. The next day, I visited Harold Weinstein, my attorney of 20 years. Unlike with Marianne, I didn't pretend to be frail with Harold. I needed him to see me as competent and clear-headed. "I'm preparing for the worst while hoping for the best," I told him, sliding a sealed envelope across his desk. "This contains evidence of what my children have been doing?" Bank statements, forged documents, recorded conversations, everything. Harold opened the envelope and skimmed through the contents, his expression darkening. "If anything happens to me, if I'm suddenly declared incompetent, if I have an accident, if I suddenly change my will, I need you to take this to the authorities immediately." Harold nodded gravely. "I've also prepared a video statement," I continued, handing him a flash drive. "It details everything in my own words, while I'm clearly of sound mind." Harold placed both items in his safe. "Have you considered reaching out to someone else in your family?" Harold asked. "Someone you trust who isn't involved in this?" His question struck a chord. In my isolation, I'd forgotten that not everyone had abandoned me. There was my brother-in-law, Frank, my late wife's brother. We'd drifted apart after Martha died, but not because of any animosity. Life just pulled us in different directions. Frank had always been straightforward, honest to a fault. My children had never been particularly close to him, which now seemed like an advantage. I called Frank that evening. His surprise at hearing my voice quickly turned to warmth. We talked for nearly an hour, catching up on the past few years. I didn't mention my situation immediately, just re-established our connection. Finally, I asked if we could meet for lunch. "I could use some family right now," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "It's been too long." Frank agreed immediately, suggesting a diner halfway between our homes for the following day. Over club sandwiches and coffee, I carefully explained what had been happening. Frank's face reddened as I spoke, his hands gripping his mug tightly. "Martha would be heartbroken," he said finally. "What can I do?" I explained that I needed someone who could check on me regularly, someone outside my children's influence. If I ever mention that the garden needs attention, that means I'm in trouble, I told him. And if I ever say I'm thinking of taking a long vacation, it means they've escalated their plans and I need immediate help. Frank nodded, committing the phrases to memory. I'm retired now, he said. I can drive by a couple times a week, call you every other day. They won't think anything of an old brother-in-law reconnecting. The relief I felt was overwhelming. Having an ally after months of isolation nearly brought tears to my eyes. My final step was perhaps the most difficult. I needed to appear increasingly vulnerable while maintaining complete awareness and control. I began forgetting small things when my children were around, misplacing my glasses, asking them to repeat themselves, mentioning news events from weeks ago as if they'd just happened. I shuffled more, let my hand tremble slightly when lifting my coffee cup. All the while, I was documenting everything, recording conversations on the device hidden in my watch, saving text messages, noting times and dates of their visits and what was discussed. I kept a detailed journal, both digital and handwritten, stored in multiple locations. With each piece I put in place, I felt both a growing sense of security and a deepening sadness. These elaborate precautions were necessary because my own children, the people I'd raised, loved, and supported, were plotting against me. As I reviewed my preparations one evening, I wondered what Martha would think of all this. She'd always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who could smooth over conflicts with a few well-chosen words. But even Martha, with her endless patience, would draw the line at outright betrayal. Tomorrow, I would begin the final phase of my plan, the confrontation I'd been preparing for since I first discovered their deception. I just hoped I was ready for whatever would come next. I spent 3 days planning the dinner, selecting each detail with the precision of a theater director staging a crucial scene. The dining room in my home had rarely seen such preparation, crystal glasses polished to a gleam, the good china with the gold rim that Margaret and I had received for our 30th anniversary, and fresh flowers arranged in the center of the table. I'd ordered catering from Bellini's, the Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated family milestones for decades. The menu was deliberate, Rebecca's favorites, ossobuco and tiramisu, alongside David's preferred Cabernet. Everything needed to feel special, but not suspicious. When they arrived at 7, I greeted them at the door, leaning slightly on my cane, a prop I'd purchased last week but hadn't needed until tonight's performance. "There you are," I said, my voice carefully modulated to sound just a touch frailer than usual. Come in, come in. I've been looking forward to this all week." Rebecca immediately took my arm, her solicitousness on full display as she guided me to my seat at the head of the table. David followed, carrying a bottle of wine, his eyes darting around the formal setting with visible curiosity. "Dad, this looks amazing," he said, settling into his chair. "What's the occasion?" I waved my hand dismissively. "Does a father need an occasion to have dinner with his son and daughter-in-law?" I poured the wine with a slightly trembling hand, not entirely feigned, as the stakes of tonight's charade had my nerves genuinely on edge. "I just wanted us to have a nice evening together. It's been a while since we've done something like this." The first course passed with casual conversation. I asked about their jobs, their friends, the renovation project they'd mentioned last month. I noticed Rebecca checking her phone twice under the table, probably messaging her sister about the unusual dinner invitation. David seemed relaxed, but watchful. I waited until the main course was served before beginning the real performance. "I've been doing some thinking," I said, setting down my fork and dabbing at my mouth with the napkin. "About the future. About arrangements. I paused, taking a sip of water, letting the moment stretch. I met with Gerald Hoffman last week. My attorney, I added unnecessarily, as they both knew Gerald well. I've made some changes to my will. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Rebecca's posture straightened, her eyes sharpening with interest, though she tried to maintain a neutral expression. David frowned slightly, setting down his wine glass. "Dad, you don't need to talk about this now," he said, but there was a tension in his voice that hadn't been there moments before. No, it's important," I insisted, allowing a slight quaver in my voice. "At my age, these things need to be clear. I've been watching how things have been going these past months." I turned to Rebecca, whose attention was now completely focused on me. "Rebecca, I've noticed how attentive you've been. The way you call to check on me, bringing groceries, helping with appointments." Her smile bloomed, practiced and perfect. "It's nothing, Richard. Your family." "It's not nothing to me," I said, reaching across to pat her hand. "And that's why I've decided to make a significant change." I took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "I've restructured my estate so that the bulk of it will go directly to you, Rebecca." The silence that followed was exquisite. Rebecca's eyes widened, her lips parting slightly as she processed my words. A flush crept up her neck to her cheeks. David's reaction was more complex, confusion, than a flash of something like hurt, quickly masked. "Dad, what are you talking about?" David finally asked. That's not how we've ever discussed this." I nodded, adopting an expression of gentle patience. "I know, son, but I've been thinking about it for some time. Rebecca has shown such dedication to my care. And frankly, I worry about how money changes hands these days, with divorces being so common." I let that land, watching David's face carefully. This way, I know my wishes will be honored, and Rebecca can make sure everything is handled properly. Rebecca's composure slipped just enough to reveal her triumph. She reached for her wineglass to hide it, but not before I caught the gleam in her eyes. "Richard, I don't know what to say. This is unexpected." "It's unnecessary," David interjected, his voice tight. "Dad, Rebecca and I are perfectly capable of managing things together. There's no need to—" "David," Rebecca cut in softly, her hand on his arm. "Your father has clearly given this a lot of thought. We should respect his wishes." The look they exchanged spoke volumes, her warning, his reluctant acquiescence. I allowed my hand to tremble more visibly as I reached for the water glass, accidentally knocking it over. Both of them jumped to help, and I used the moment of distraction to further my performance, looking momentarily confused about what had happened. "Oh dear, I'm so sorry," I mumbled, fumbling with my napkin. "It's fine, Dad," David said, concern replacing his earlier tension. "Are you feeling okay?" "You seem tired." "Just a little," I admitted, slumping slightly in my chair. These days catch up with me faster than they used to. I rubbed my temple, adding, "The medication makes me a bit foggy sometimes." Rebecca was instantly solicitous, moving to my side. "Maybe we should finish dessert another time." "You should rest." No, I protested weakly. "I've been looking forward to this. And there's tiramisu." I smiled up at her. "Besides, I wanted to show you both something." I slowly rose, waving off their assistance, and shuffled to the sideboard where I'd placed a folder earlier. Returning to the table, I opened it with deliberate clumsiness, spilling several bank statements across the tablecloth. "These came yesterday," I said, as if it were an explanation. "From the offshore account Margaret and I set up years ago. I'd nearly forgotten about it with everything else going on." I watched as their eyes scanned the documents, lingering on the balance. 2.4 million, a sum neither of them had known existed, separate from the estate they'd been inventorying behind my back. "Dad," David said slowly, "I had no idea you and Mom had this much set aside." "Oh, Margaret was always careful with our savings," I said vaguely, gathering the papers with shaky hands. "She believed in diversifying. There are a few other accounts too, I think. I should organize all this better." I yawned, not entirely for show. The evening's performance had been exhausting. "Maybe you can help me with that soon, Rebecca? Since you'll be handling everything eventually." Rebecca's smile was dazzling, her eyes calculating even as she helped me return the statements to the folder. "Of course, Richard. Whatever you need." As they helped clear the table, insisting I rest, I caught the whispered exchange between them in the kitchen. Urgent, excited. The trap was baited now, and they were circling it hungrily. I would need to contact my actual attorney in the morning to prepare for the next phase. The real documents would need to be ready when they made their move, which, judging by Rebecca's barely contained eagerness, wouldn't be long now. The clock read 2:17 a.m. when I finally inserted the memory card from the hidden camera into my laptop. My hands were steady, steadier than they'd been in months. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards settling. I'd waited until I was certain both Robert and Vanessa had left for their weekend trip to the coast, a celebration, they'd said, for their good fortune. My good fortune, technically. The fortune they believed would soon be theirs. I'd installed the camera 3 days ago, after the will reading, hiding it inside the decorative clock on the mantel in the living room. It was the same clock my late wife had chosen 30 years ago, the one Robert and Vanessa had tried to convince me to replace last Christmas. "It's outdated, Dad," Robert had said. "Let's get you something more modern." Now I understood why. They'd been planning to use that room for private conversations. The clock they despised had become my silent witness. The video began playing, showing my living room bathed in the soft glow of the table lamps. The timestamp showed 11:42 p.m. 2 nights ago. Robert and Vanessa entered the frame, champagne glasses in hand. They'd waited until they thought I was asleep. I watched as they settled on the sofa, Vanessa kicking off her shoes and tucking her feet under her. She was smiling, not the polite, measured smile she wore around me, but something wilder, almost predatory. "To Harold's generosity," she said, raising her glass, "and to his failing health." They clinked glasses, and Robert laughed, though something in his expression seemed forced. I paused the video, studying my son's face. There was discomfort there, a tightness around his eyes that I recognized from when he was a child and knew he was doing something wrong. I pressed play again. "Did you see Meredith's face when the lawyer read that you get the house?" Robert said, refilling their glasses from a bottle of my 30-year-old Macallan, a bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion. She looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. "Your sister never thought I was good enough for you," Vanessa replied, her words slightly slurred. "But who's laughing now? 6 months, maybe less, and we'll have everything. The house, the accounts, all of it." She took another sip, then leaned in closer to Robert. "The new medication is working faster than I expected. Have you noticed how he's getting more confused? That's not accidental." I felt a chill run through me, but not surprise. Part of me had suspected something like this, which was why I'd installed the camera in the first place. I'd been experiencing strange symptoms lately: dizziness, confusion, memory lapses, symptoms that seemed to worsen after Vanessa insisted on organizing my medications into those weekly pill containers. "It's for your safety," she'd said with that concerned look she'd perfected. "What exactly are you giving him?" Robert asked, his voice lower now. He glanced toward the hallway that led to my bedroom, unaware that I'd taken to sleeping in the guest room on the opposite side of the house, another precaution I hadn't shared with them. Vanessa laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Remember my friend Diane who works at the pharmacy? She's been helping me. A little extra digoxin mixed with his heart medication. Enough to create symptoms, but not enough to raise suspicions. And I've been crushing Ambien into his evening tea. That's why he's been so drowsy and confused at night." I paused the video again, taking a deep breath. My tea? The one Vanessa had started bringing me every evening, insisting it would help me sleep better. The tea I'd been pouring down the bathroom sink for the past 2 weeks after I noticed the strange bitter aftertaste and how disoriented I felt afterward. I'd switched doctors 3 weeks ago without telling them, and my new physician had found no medical reason for my symptoms. I continued watching as Vanessa detailed her plans with a clinical precision that was chilling. The best part is, everyone already thinks he's declining. Dr. Peterson is convinced it's early dementia. I made sure to mention all the right symptoms when I took him to his appointments. Isn't this going too far?" Robert asked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "We could just wait. He's 72. Eventually? Eventually what?" "He could live another 15 years, Vanessa snapped. "His father lived to 91. Do you want to wait that long? We've already waited 7 years since your mother died." "I'm tired of waiting, Robert. I'm tired of living in that tiny house when all of this could be ours." My son didn't respond immediately. He looked down at his glass, then around the room at the home I'd built, the home where I'd raised him. I watched his face, searching for some sign of the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, the teenager I'd consoled through his first heartbreak, the young man I'd helped through college. I wanted to see hesitation, resistance, anything that would tell me my son was not completely lost to me. "I tried something new in his coffee this morning," Vanessa continued when Robert remained silent. "Something that should make his confusion more noticeable. If we're lucky, he'll have some kind of episode in public. Then we can talk about assisted living. Once he's out of the house, it gets much easier." Robert finally spoke. "Just make sure it looks natural. I don't want him to suffer. Not an objection. Not a refusal. Just a request for a painless death for his father." I felt something inside me harden as I watched my son, my only son, tacitly approve my murder. I watched the rest of the video, nearly 40 minutes of them discussing their plans for my money, my house, my possessions. They talked about selling my classic car collection, about renovations they'd make to the house, about how they'd handle my difficult friends who might ask too many questions. Through it all, I remained perfectly still, my breathing even, my mind clear in a way it hadn't been for months. The fog of confusion that had plagued me lifted entirely, replaced by a crystalline clarity of purpose. When the video ended, I ejected the memory card and placed it in a small waterproof case, which I then sealed inside an envelope addressed to my attorney. Tomorrow I would make copies and secure them in different locations. But tonight, I had other preparations to make. I looked at my reflection in the darkened computer screen, an old man with tired eyes but steady hands and a resolute expression. They thought I was weak, confused, an easy target. They had no idea what was coming. As I closed my laptop, I felt no anger, no grief. Just a calm, implacable resolve. They would be returning from their weekend trip in 2 days, expecting to find me here, increasingly frail and confused. Instead, they would find the first stage of my response already in motion. I scheduled the family meeting for Sunday afternoon at 3. My sister Margaret flew in from Phoenix, and I arranged for my brother-in-law Thomas to be there as well. My niece Catherine and her husband drove up from San Diego. I even invited Pastor Jim, who had known our family for over 30 years. The dining room of my home, the home Richard and Vanessa had been so eager to claim, was set with coffee, water, and the small butter cookies Margaret had always loved. Everything appeared normal, hospitable. The stage was set. Richard and Vanessa arrived 15 minutes late. I noticed their surprise at seeing the extended family gathered around my dining room table. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, darting from face to face. "Dad, you didn't mention everyone would be here?" Vanessa's smile tightened as she took in the scene. I had been careful not to reveal the true nature of this meeting when I invited them, saying only that I wanted to discuss some important family matters. They had assumed, no doubt, that I was finally ready to discuss accelerating their inheritance plans. "Please sit down," I said, gesturing to the 2 empty chairs I deliberately placed facing everyone else. "I've asked everyone here because what I'm about to share concerns our entire family." I had rehearsed this moment countless times over the past week, practicing with Detective Harmon how to maintain my composure. My hands were steady as I opened the leather portfolio on the table. "Before we begin, I want to thank everyone for coming, especially those who traveled so far." I started methodically, the way my attorney had suggested. First, the financial records. I distributed copies of bank statements showing 17 unauthorized transfers totaling $42,680 from my accounts to a joint account Richard and Vanessa had opened 6 months ago. I explained how my financial advisor had discovered the discrepancies and how we traced the IP addresses used for the transfers back to their home network. These transactions occurred while I was hospitalized for what we now know was not a series of accidents. Richard's face flushed. "Dad, I can explain. We were just trying to protect your assets." "You've been confused lately, making poor decisions." Vanessa nodded vigorously beside him. My sister Margaret's sharp intake of breath was audible across the table. I ignored them and continued. "Next, I'd like to show you all something disturbing." I connected my laptop to the television mounted on the dining room wall. The footage from the hidden cameras played in silence. There was Vanessa in my kitchen, carefully opening my pill organizer. The timestamp showed 4:17 a.m. 3 weeks ago. We watched as she replaced several of my heart medication tablets with similar-looking pills, then meticulously rearranged everything exactly as she'd found it. The second clip showed Richard in my study, photographing documents from my filing cabinet, including my investment portfolio and insurance policies. The third clip showed them both in my bedroom while I was asleep, searching through my nightstand drawer where I kept my spare house keys. That's not what it looks like," Vanessa stammered, her voice higher than usual. "I was organizing your medications to help you. The doctor said—" I cut her off by playing the audio recording. Their voices filled the room. "Once we get power of attorney, we can liquidate the investment properties," Richard was saying. "The medical reports will show he's not competent. Dr. Winters owes me after that billing arrangement we worked out." Vanessa's voice. "How long before the medication changes start showing effects?" Richard again. "Dad's already having dizzy spells." "Another few weeks, and he'll be confused enough that no one will question it." The silence that followed was absolute. My niece Catherine had tears streaming down her face. Pastor Jim stared at the floor, his expression grim. Thomas, always the most even-tempered in our family, was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles had turned white. "This is illegal surveillance!" Richard suddenly shouted, standing up. "You can't record people without their consent. None of this would be admissible in court." "Actually," I said quietly, Detective Harmon from the Financial Crimes Unit assured me that in cases of suspected elder abuse, these recordings are perfectly admissible. He has copies of everything you've just seen. I slid a folder across the table. These are the lab results from the pills Vanessa substituted. They contained gradually increasing doses of benzodiazepines, not my prescribed medication. That explains the confusion, memory lapses, and falls I experienced over the past 3 months. Vanessa's composure finally broke. "You ungrateful old man! After everything we've done for you! Who do you think has been taking care of you? Driving you to appointments? Bringing you groceries? Your precious Margaret only shows up when there's something in it for her." Margaret started to respond, but I raised my hand. "There's one more thing you should know." I removed a document from my portfolio, the fake will I had created with my attorney's guidance. "This will, which I know you photographed for my study last month, is not valid. It was created specifically as evidence after we discovered your activities. My actual will, executed last week, is quite different." Richard's face contorted with rage. "You can't do this to us. We've built our lives around the expectation of that inheritance. We've made commitments, investments. Based on money that wasn't yours," my brother-in-law Thomas interjected, speaking for the first time. "Money you were willing to poison your father to get." "You'll regret this," Richard hissed, grabbing Vanessa's arm and pulling her toward the door. "We'll contest everything. We'll tell everyone you're mentally incompetent. No one will believe you over us. We're respected in this community." I remained seated as they stormed out, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the windows. The room stayed silent for several long moments. Finally, Pastor Jim placed his hand gently on my shoulder. "Walter, I'm so sorry." I had no idea. I nodded, suddenly feeling every one of my 72 years. The confrontation was over, but I knew the real battle was just beginning. Richard and Vanessa wouldn't disappear quietly, not with what they believed they were entitled to slipping away. As my family gathered around me with questions and concerns, I realized I needed to prepare for what would come next. The legal proceedings that would determine not just the fate of my assets, but possibly my son's freedom as well. The security company called me at 2:17 a.m., 3 days after our confrontation. I was already half awake, my sleep pattern shattered by recent events. The representative's voice was calm but urgent. "Mr. Harrison, we've detected a breach at your residence. Police have been dispatched. Would you like us to stay on the line?" I thanked her but declined. This wasn't unexpected. In fact, I'd been waiting for it. After hanging up, I pulled on a robe and slippers, then made my way downstairs to wait. The newly installed security cameras, part of the upgraded system I'd put in after discovering the poisoning attempt, were accessible through my phone. I watched the footage in real time as 2 figures moved through my darkened home. They wore hoodies and gloves, but I didn't need to see their faces. The shorter figure's distinctive gait was unmistakable. My son David had a slight limp from a college baseball injury. The taller one moved with the practiced efficiency I'd seen countless times at family gatherings, as Melissa organized everything from holiday meals to vacation itineraries. They went straight to my home office, making a beeline for the filing cabinet where I'd previously kept all my financial records and the evidence of their betrayal. I watched as David jimmied the lock while Melissa stood guard at the door. When they pulled open the drawer containing the folder labeled medical records, their body language showed immediate relief. They didn't know I'd removed everything of importance weeks ago, leaving only decoy papers. The real evidence, The blood test results showing elevated levels of arsenic, the pharmacy records, the bank statements showing the life insurance policy they'd taken out, and the recorded conversations were all safely stored with my attorney, with digital copies secured in 3 different locations. The police arrived 12 minutes after the alarm was triggered. I met them at the front door in my robe, explaining that the intruders were still inside. When the officers entered with flashlights drawn, they found my son and daughter-in-law frantically stuffing papers into a backpack. The look on David's face when the lights came on and he saw me standing in the doorway with the police, it wasn't fear or shame. It was rage. Pure, unfiltered rage that his plan had failed again. "Dad, this isn't what it looks like," he stammered as an officer secured his hands behind his back. Melissa remained silent, her eyes darting around the room, likely calculating her next move. The officers were professional but confused by the situation. I explained that these were my son and daughter-in-law, and yes, I wanted to press charges for breaking and entering. I also informed them that this incident was connected to an ongoing investigation regarding an attempted poisoning, my attempted murder, and that Detective Ramirez from the county's Major Crimes Unit was handling the case. One of the officers recognized the name and stepped outside to make a call. While we waited, Melissa finally broke her silence. "Richard," she said, using my first name as she always did when trying to manipulate me, "we can make this right. There's been a terrible misunderstanding." Her voice had that honeyed quality she used when asking for money for one of their business ventures. She continued, "We were just worried about you. Your memory hasn't been reliable lately, and we were concerned about some of the decisions you've been making." The officers exchanged glances, but said nothing. David picked up her cue. "Dad, I've been under a lot of pressure. Melissa, she convinced me you weren't thinking clearly, that we needed to protect the family assets." He glanced at his wife with what appeared to be newfound resentment. "She said it would be better for everyone if we had control of your finances before you gave everything away to charities or got scammed." He lowered his voice. "I never wanted to hurt you. It was her idea to add the supplements to your food. She said they were just to make you more compliant, to help you sleep. I didn't know what she was really doing. I had expected this, the moment when they would turn on each other. What I hadn't anticipated was how little it would affect me. 43 years of loving my son, and now I felt nothing watching him try to save himself by sacrificing his wife." Melissa's face contorted with shock before settling into a cold mask. "That's not true," she hissed. "David was the one who researched the dosages. He said it would look natural at your age." The officer standing guard told them both to be quiet. Detective Ramirez arrived 30 minutes later. By then, David and Melissa had been separated and placed in different patrol cars. Ramirez and I spoke briefly in the kitchen. I handed him a flash drive containing copies of the security footage from that night. "This should help with the breaking and entering charges," I said, "and it demonstrates consciousness of guilt regarding the other matter." Ramirez nodded, placing the drive in an evidence bag. "We've been building the poisoning case," he said. "The lab confirmed arsenic in the samples you provided from your home, and it matches the levels found in your blood work. With this break-in attempt and their statements tonight, we have enough to move forward with attempted murder charges." He paused. "You should know they'll likely make bail. Do you have somewhere else you can stay?" I assured him I'd be fine. Before he left, Ramirez allowed me a supervised moment with David. My son's eyes were red-rimmed, but dry. "Dad," he said, his voice low and threatening, "if you go through with this, if you disinherit me, we'll fight it. We have documentation of your confusion, your memory lapses. Melissa's brother is a psychiatrist. He's prepared statements about your declining mental state. We'll tie this up in court for years. By the time it's over, there won't be anything left for anyone." His face softened into something resembling the boy I once knew. "Or we can make a deal now. Drop the charges, keep this in the family. I'll divorce Melissa. It can be just you and me again, like when Mom died." I studied his face, searching for any trace of the child I had raised, the young man who had once shown such promise. All I saw was a stranger wearing my son's features, a man consumed by greed and entitlement. I turned away without responding and nodded to the officer to take him. As they led him to the patrol car, I began mentally preparing for the meeting with my estate attorney scheduled for later that morning. The house felt emptier than it had in years, but somehow I felt lighter than I had in months. I watched the evening news with a hollow feeling in my chest as they showed footage of Jessica being led from her office in handcuffs. The reporter's voice was clinical, detached. "Local accountant arrested on multiple charges of elder financial abuse and fraud." They blurred my name in the court documents they flashed on screen, but everyone in our community would know. The camera caught her face for just a moment, shock mixed with something like indignation, as if she still couldn't believe she'd been caught. I turned off the television before they could mention Thomas. My son wasn't in handcuffs. Not yet. Detective Reeves called me the next morning. "Mr. Harmon, I wanted to update you personally. The DA is pursuing charges against Jessica for financial exploitation, fraud, and identity theft. The evidence from those bank records and the forged documents is substantial." He paused before continuing. "As for your son, the investigation is ongoing. The prosecutor believes he was complicit in at least some of the schemes, particularly the attempted property transfer. They're reviewing the evidence to determine appropriate charges." I thanked him, my voice steadier than I expected. After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the family photo I still hadn't taken down. Thomas's graduation from business school, his arm around Jessica, both smiling at the camera while I stood proudly beside them. 17 years ago. The frame suddenly felt too heavy in my hands, and I placed it face down on the table. This was the consequence of my actions, my own family splintering apart in the most public, permanent way possible. I had set these wheels in motion, yet I wasn't the one who'd betrayed the fundamental trust between parent and child. Later that afternoon, my attorney Diane arrived with a thick folder of documents. "The judge granted the emergency protective order," she explained, spreading papers across my dining room table. "Thomas and Jessica cannot come within 500 feet of you or your property. They're also barred from accessing any of your accounts or attempting to contact you directly." She pointed to another document. "The freeze on all your assets will remain until the criminal proceedings conclude, but the judge has allowed for your normal living expenses to be exempted." Her finger traced down to the bottom line. "You'll need to appear at the hearing next month to make this permanent." I signed where indicated, my pen hesitating only briefly. Each signature felt like another brick in a wall I was building between myself and my only son. "What happens to Thomas now?" I asked. "That depends on the DA's office," Diane said, her tone softening slightly. "The evidence suggests he knew about Jessica's actions, possibly helped plan some of them. At minimum, he'll likely face accessory charges." She gathered the papers methodically. "Richard, I need to prepare you. This isn't going to be quick or clean. Jessica's attorney has already indicated they'll fight every charge. And if Thomas is formally charged, you can expect the same from him." I nodded, remembering Thomas's face at our last confrontation, the cold calculation behind his eyes when he realized I had discovered everything. No remorse, just anger at being caught. "I understand. There's more," Diane continued, pulling out another document. Jessica's parents have filed for emergency visitation rights to your grandchildren. They're claiming you've created an unstable environment. She met my eyes directly. This is just the beginning of the family court battles. These cases can drag on for years. Richard, are you certain you want to see this through? There are still options for a quieter resolution. The question hung in the air between us. A quieter resolution meant allowing them to keep some of what they'd stolen, dropping charges in exchange for distance. It meant Jessica might avoid prison, that Thomas might escape with minimal consequences. It meant my grandchildren would grow up learning that betrayal carried no real penalty. I thought of the $230,000 they'd already taken, the house deed they'd nearly stolen, the medications they'd manipulated. I remembered the cold calculation in their planning, documented in those emails. This wasn't a mistake or a momentary lapse. It was a systematic campaign to strip me of everything while I was grieving Martha. I'm seeing this through, I said finally. Whatever it costs, however long it takes. Some things need to be brought into the light. My voice didn't waver. I didn't cause this destruction, Diane. They did? I'm just refusing to help hide it anymore. She nodded, respect evident in her expression. Then we prepare for a long fight. I'll file our response to the grandparents' petition tomorrow. As she packed up her briefcase, she added, "The DA wants to meet with you again next week. They'll need your testimony for the preliminary hearing." After Diane left, I sat alone in my too-quiet house, the weight of what was coming settling over me. The criminal proceedings, the family court battles, the community whispers, the grandchildren caught in the middle. I'd never wanted any of this. I'd spent 68 years building a life of integrity, of family loyalty. Now I was the man who'd sent his daughter-in-law to jail and his son to face criminal charges. The man whose family was disintegrating in newspaper headlines and court documents. The doorbell rang just after 6. I opened it to find my nephew Michael standing there with his wife Emma, a casserole dish in her hands. Behind them were Martha's sister Helen and her husband, along with 2 of my cousins I hadn't seen since Martha's funeral. Their faces showed concern, but something else too: determination. "We heard," Michael said simply. "We're here." He stepped forward and embraced me, a gesture so unexpected I nearly broke down right there on the porch. Over dinner, they shared what I hadn't known, the warning signs they'd seen but hadn't wanted to mention while I was grieving. How Thomas had asked several of them for loans over the years that were never repaid. How Jessica had made comments about my house being wasted on just one person at the funeral reception. How they'd noticed my increasing isolation but hadn't known how to intervene. "We should have said something sooner," Helen said, Martha's expressions echoing in her similar features. "But we're here now, Richard. Whatever you need, however long this takes. You're not facing this alone." As they helped clean up before leaving, Michael pulled me aside. "Uncle Richard, I've taken some time off work. I'll go with you to the DA meeting, to the hearings, to whatever comes next. We all will in shifts if necessary." He squeezed my shoulder. "What they did wasn't your fault. And what happens next isn't your burden to carry alone." After they left, I stood in my kitchen, the house quieter, but somehow less empty than before. Tomorrow would bring more legal documents, more difficult decisions, more steps toward a justice that would forever change my family. But tonight, for the first time since this all began, I felt the faintest flicker of something I'd thought was lost, the sense that even in this broken landscape, I wasn't standing alone. 3 months passed like a slow-turning wheel. Winter had given way to spring, and I found myself sitting in the back of a courtroom, watching as Melissa stood before the judge in a navy pantsuit that couldn't hide how much weight she'd lost. The prosecutor was methodically laying out the case against her: financial exploitation of an elder, fraud, and conspiracy charges. The evidence they'd assembled was substantial: forged signatures, manipulated bank statements, recorded phone calls with the financial advisor she'd tried to bribe. I felt no joy watching her shoulders slump as the judge denied her attorney's motion to dismiss. Just a hollow vindication that the truth was finally being recognized. Outside the courthouse, my attorney Catherine updated me on Robert's situation. "Your son's assets are frozen while they untangle which funds were legitimate and which came from the gambling operation," she explained as we walked to her car. "Between his legal bills, the gambling debts that surfaced during discovery, and the civil penalties, he's essentially bankrupt." The investigators had uncovered that Robert had been running an illegal sports betting operation for nearly 3 years, something I never would have suspected. His desperation for money ran deeper than I'd imagined. The family home where my grandchildren lived was in foreclosure proceedings, and Robert was staying with a friend while awaiting his own court date for lesser charges. I had arranged for my grandchildren's school tuition to be paid directly to the institution. They shouldn't suffer for their parents' crimes. My own life had taken an unexpected turn. What began as casual conversations with other seniors at the community center about my experience had evolved into something more structured. With Catherine's help and a portion of my recovered funds, I established the Dignity First Foundation. We were small but focused on a clear mission: education and advocacy for elder financial abuse prevention. I'd secured office space in a modest building downtown, hired a part-time coordinator named Denise, and begun developing materials for community workshops. The foundation gave me purpose, a reason to get dressed and leave the house each morning. "You've become quite the advocate," my sister Jean remarked one Sunday afternoon as we sat on her patio. Our relationship had been strained for years before all this happened, but now we were having weekly dinners. "Remember how shy you were about public speaking in high school?" Dad would be proud. She poured more iced tea into my glass. The mention of our father didn't sting as it once might have. Instead, I felt a connection to him in this work. He'd always believed in standing up for people who couldn't defend themselves. My circle was expanding in other ways too. I'd reconnected with Thomas and Philip, friends from my working days whom I'd gradually lost touch with during my isolation. We met monthly for lunch at a diner near the harbor where we used to grab quick meals during our lunch breaks decades ago. They didn't treat me with the awkward pity I'd feared. Instead, they shared their own stories of family complications and life's unexpected turns. Philip's daughter had struggled with addiction for years before finding recovery. Thomas had lost most of his retirement in a business venture gone wrong and had to start over at 62. Their resilience reminded me that second acts were possible at our age. The foundation work brought me into contact with other survivors of family financial abuse. Each Tuesday, I facilitated a support group. Listening to their stories, some far worse than mine, I recognized patterns I'd been blind to in my own situation. A retired teacher named Margaret had lost her home to a nephew. A widower named James had been systematically defrauded by his stepdaughter over 7 years. Their trust had been weaponized against them, just as mine had been. "The hardest part," Margaret said during one session, "is accepting that someone you love saw you as nothing more than a resource to exploit." The room had fallen silent then, each of us sitting with that painful truth. My relationship with my grandchildren remained complicated. I saw them twice a month for supervised visits arranged through their maternal aunt, who had temporary custody while Melissa's case proceeded. 8-year-old Emma asked difficult questions I tried to answer honestly, but age-appropriately. 12-year-old Jason was more withdrawn, angry at the world that had upended his life. "Is Dad going to jail too?" he asked during our last visit, his voice small despite his attempt to sound tough. I told him I didn't know for certain, but that his father was facing consequences for his choices. "People can make terrible mistakes," I said carefully, "and still have the chance to become better." I wasn't sure if I believed that about Robert yet, but I wanted it to be true for Jason's sake. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in a plain white envelope with my name and address written in the familiar handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and Christmas notes for decades. I recognized Robert's penmanship immediately. For several hours, I left it unopened on my kitchen counter, going about my day with the letter's presence hovering in my awareness. After dinner, I finally sat down with a cup of tea and opened it. "Dad," it began simply, "I've written this letter 17 times. No version seems adequate, but I need to try anyway." What followed were 4 pages of the most honest communication I'd had from my son in years. He wrote about his gambling addiction that had started as casual betting with colleagues and spiraled into consuming debt. He described his shame at failing in his business ventures and his inability to admit those failures to me. "I told myself I deserved your money more than you did because you weren't using it. I convinced myself I was entitled to it because I was family. I justified every step deeper into betrayal." There was no request for forgiveness or money, no attempt to minimize what he'd done. Just an accounting of his failures and a statement that he was finally getting help through a court-mandated program. "I don't expect this to repair anything between us," he concluded, "but you deserve to hear the truth at least once from me, without manipulation or lies." He signed it simply, "Your son, Robert." I folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope, my hand steady, but my heart turbulent with emotions I couldn't yet name. That night, I sat on my balcony watching the city lights, thinking about second chances and whether some bridges, once burned, could ever truly be rebuilt. The foundation work was teaching me that healing wasn't a destination, but a direction, a path you chose daily. I didn't know if Robert and I would ever find our way back to anything resembling a father-son relationship. But for the first time since this ordeal began, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that something new might eventually grow in the ashes of what we'd lost. Tomorrow, I would meet with a group of law students who had volunteered to help with the Foundation's educational outreach. Life was moving forward, one careful step at a time. The autumn sun filtered through my kitchen window as I sipped my morning coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. 1 year had passed since the courthouse steps, since Thomas's sentencing, since I had made the hardest decision of my life. My doctor had just given me a clean bill of health at my quarterly checkup, blood pressure normal, heart rhythm steady, and energy levels better than they'd been in years. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up," Dr. Patel had said with a smile. I didn't tell her that the biggest change was simply not being slowly poisoned by my own son. I ran my finger along the rim of my coffee mug, the ceramic smooth against my skin. The tremors that had plagued my hands for months had disappeared entirely. No more mysterious dizzy spells, no more unexplained fatigue that left me bedridden for days. The cabinet above my sink now held only medications I actually needed, each one in a locked container with a digital timer that recorded when it was opened, a precaution suggested by my new home health aide, Marjorie. She came 3 times a week now, not because I needed constant care, but because we'd become friends. She brought homemade banana bread and stories about her grandchildren, and I taught her to play chess. Simple pleasures I'd nearly forgotten existed. The house felt different too. I'd had the locks changed, the security system upgraded, and most importantly, I'd filled it with people I could trust. Every Thursday evening, a group of fellow retirees gathered in my living room for dinner. We took turns hosting, but they seemed to prefer my place, perhaps because I'd finally learned to cook something other than microwave dinners. Last week, Robert, a former high school principal, had brought his new girlfriend, and we'd stayed up until midnight, sharing stories and laughter. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done that before everything happened with Thomas. The manila envelope on my kitchen table contained the final paperwork for the scholarship fund. After months of meetings with attorneys and financial advisors, we had established the Second Chances Scholarship at the local community college. The $350,000 that had once been earmarked for Thomas now would help students who had overcome significant personal challenges to pursue higher education. The first 5 recipients had been selected last month, among them a young woman recovering from addiction, a former foster child, and a middle-aged man retraining after losing his job of 20 years. I'd met them all at the small ceremony where we'd announced the awards. Their gratitude had been overwhelming, but what struck me most was their determination. They weren't looking for handouts, they were looking for opportunities to rebuild their lives. The irony wasn't lost on me. The money that Thomas had tried to steal through deception would now help strangers who faced their challenges honestly. I signed the final document authorizing the annual funding schedule and slipped it back into the envelope. Tomorrow, I would deliver it to the foundation that would manage the endowment in perpetuity. The scholarship would outlive me, perhaps the most meaningful legacy I could leave behind. I still thought about Thomas every day, though the sharp pain had dulled to a persistent ache. He would be eligible for parole in another 4 years. His letters had stopped coming after I returned the third one unopened. The therapist I'd been seeing, Dr. Winters, had helped me understand that maintaining that boundary wasn't cruelty. It was self-preservation. You can forgive without allowing someone back into a position where they can harm you again, she'd said during one of our sessions. I wasn't sure if I had forgiven him yet, but I had stopped blaming myself for his choices. My daughter Rebecca called every Sunday now, without fail. Our relationship had deepened in ways I hadn't expected. She'd been the one to suggest I join the community garden where I now spent Tuesday and Friday mornings, tending to tomatoes and zucchini, with dirt under my fingernails and the sun on my back. Her children, my grandchildren, visited monthly, filling the house with noise and energy. Last month, 12-year-old Emma had asked to see photographs of my late wife, her grandmother. We'd spent an afternoon going through albums I hadn't opened in years, and I'd found myself telling stories I'd almost forgotten. "You laugh like her," I'd told Emma, and the smile that spread across her face had been worth every painful memory the photographs stirred up. The hardest lesson of the past year had been learning to distinguish between familial obligation and genuine love. For too long, I'd confused the two, believing that blood ties automatically conferred both rights and responsibilities that transcended normal boundaries. I'd allowed Thomas's manipulation because I thought that's what fathers did. They sacrificed for their children, no matter the cost. Now I understood that real love required honesty, respect, and mutual care. It couldn't exist alongside exploitation and deception. Some days this knowledge felt like freedom. Other days, it felt like loss. I rose from the kitchen table and walked to the window that overlooked my backyard. The maple tree I'd planted 40 years ago blazed with autumn colors, red and gold against the clear blue sky. I'd watched that tree grow from a sapling, weathering storms and drought years, dropping leaves each fall, only to renew itself each spring. At 73, I didn't know how many more seasons I would witness, but I found unexpected peace in that uncertainty. The path that had brought me here had been painful beyond imagining, but it had also been clarifying. I no longer feared being alone with my thoughts or facing whatever time I had left. Tomorrow, I would meet with the young journalist who wanted to document my story for a series on elder abuse and financial exploitation. Initially, I'd hesitated, not wanting to expose family wounds to public scrutiny. But then I'd received a letter from an old colleague whose brother had experienced something similar. If I had known what to look for, he wrote, perhaps I could have helped him sooner. And so I would speak, not to shame Thomas or to gain sympathy for myself, but because truth, however difficult, had healing power. In my twilight years, I had discovered that the most valuable legacy wasn't money or property, but honesty, with others and with oneself. It was a lesson learned at great cost, but one I would carry forward into whatever days remained.